Coming up on the Elmore Leonard podcast is S.A. Cosby, the best-selling and award-winning author of My Darkest Prayer, Blacktop Wasteland, All the Sinners Bleed, The Rhythm of Time, written with Questlove, joins us to talk Elmore, growing up in Virginia, his other influences, as well as his new book, King of Ashes, which is out now. Please enjoy S.A. Cosby. Sean, let me officially welcome you to the Elmore Leonard podcast. We really appreciate you being here, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you guys for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
We're really excited to talk to you for a lot of reasons, but I like to start the conversation pretty much with the same question for everybody, mainly because we tend to get a different answer. So what was the book of Elmore's that really drew you in? May not have been the first book of his that you read, but the one book where you said to yourself, wow, this guy's got something pretty interesting to say here.
The first book by Elmore Leonard I ever read was given to me by my 11th grade high school English teacher, who knew I was an aspiring writer. And so he gave me Ryan's Rules, which is also known as Swag. And that was the first Elmore Leonard novel I ever read. And I remember, I think I was 17, and I just remember up to that point, I'd been a big horror fan. Well, let me rephrase it. I'd read a lot of horror. I was a huge just reading fan in general. I like to read. So I'd read like early American crime fiction, the American noir, sort of pantheon with Chandler and Hammett and Ross McDonald and John D. McDonald. Chester Himes is a part of that as well. But I also read a lot of horror. I read a lot of Stephen King and Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and Richard Matheson and so on and so forth, and Clive Barker and all that. So I liked horror and crime, and one of my friends who's a writer, Ed Kurtz, always says that horror and crime are kissing cousins. I like to say they're in the same church, but they sit in different pews. But anyway, the first book that I read by Elmore Leonard was Ryan's Rules, like I said, alternatively called Swag. And I just was so blown away by the book in general, but the specificity of the characterizations, like with Ernest J. Stickley, who is the character that shows up again and again, or a few more times in Leonard's pantheon. But for me, it was very interesting as a kid from the South, from a small Southern town. Stick could have been, the dad or uncle of the kids I went to school with. And so sort of that gave me such a resonance for the book. And then also just the sort of very, on the surface, simplistic plotting that is really sort of that Swiss clock plotting masquerading as a very sort of by the numbers sort of narrative. All of that really fascinated me. And after that, I just kind of looked up everything he'd ever written.
First off, shout out to your 11th grade teacher. What was your teacher's name? Or what is your
Mr. Bone, Jeff Bone. He was a person that inspired me to take writing seriously. And he was a writer. He was a teacher that really sort of encouraged me to be a writer and encouraged me to find my voice. So he was a great mentor for me.
Wow. That's because I know Swag. I love Swag. We've talked about it on the podcast. And a high school teacher giving it to a student is good for him. It's a great book. That's fantastic. I can't remember what I got to read in high school, but it was not Swag.
Well, let me also clarify that wasn't a part of the syllabus. That was he had given me that after class one day. He would always give me books that weren't necessarily on the syllabus because he knew or thought I would appreciate them. So every once in a while I'd get like I said Elmore Leonard, or I'd get like a George Higgins, or something like a Carson McCullers, or something like James Baldwin. He was always sliding me books on my way out the door, and because I gave him back to him. I read it and it was his personal copy. and so he just told me later, he said, I just thought, with your gift of voice, that this would resonate with you. And it did.
So what were you writing in 11th grade? Was it just regular as part of your like coursework? And he really noticed it, or you were doing this like, tell me about that, because that's
so I always wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to be a writer. I wrote my first story when I was 7 years old for my mom.
Oh my gosh.
And I didn't know how to become a writer, though. I didn't know how you went about getting published. I'd read stuff by Stephen King, but of course, by the time I started writing, the short story markets that Stephen King made his bread and butter on had dried up.
Yeah.
And so I was just writing stuff for fun. And I, I used to write stories about the teachers we didn't like in my school, and I would pass them around to my friends. And he intercepted one of these stories. They were all handwritten. And he intercepted one, and he made me stay after class. And I thought I was in a lot of trouble. And at first, he was like, "Look, stop writing these stories about other teachers." He said,
Right.
"Even though I may agree with some of your observations, you're going to get in trouble." I'm like, okay. And then he said, but then he said, "You have a real talent for this. Like, yeah, this is a tongue-in-cheek story about a teacher you don't like getting mauled by an escaped lion that finds his way into the parking lot of the school." But he was like, "So you have a real talent and a gift for narrative and atmosphere and voice." And I really know what those terms meant. I was like, "Oh, okay." And so anyway, once he realized that was something that I wanted to do or wanted to pursue, we did the regular coursework. But then, like I said, he would slide me books that he thought would have an impact, and they did. And at the end of this term, he gave me 2 books as a gift. He gave me The Elements of Style by Strunk and White,
Oh,
and he gave me The Collected Works of Samuel Beckett, which is a brick of a book. And he said the first book will teach you how to write. The second book will teach you why you write. And I still have those books today.
that's tremendous. Is he still teaching? Is he
He's
retired? Are
not
you in
teaching. He's
touch with him at
retired, but
all?
he's still around. I did my first book signing in my hometown about 4 years ago, and
Oh
I
wow.
had lost touch with him. I didn't know where he was, and ultimately, I found out he and his partner had retired and moved to Europe, and they were teaching English
Oh wow.
in Eastern European, former Soviet bloc countries, and he made a trip to come back to the United States to come to my book signing, and
Wow.
it's so funny because he had encouraged me to go to college, and I went, but ultimately I wasn't able to finish. Unfortunately, I had some family issues. I didn't have a lot of money growing up anyway, and then my mom got sick, so I ended up having to drop out. And so I would see
Okay.
him around town after he retired, but before he left, and he would always stop me like in the grocery store. "You still writing?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm kind of messing with it." He's like, "Don't give up, don't give up. You're really talented." And so
Wow.
we were doing the book signing, and he came up to me, and I looked up, and I didn't recognize him at first. His hair had grown, he had a beard, and then I
Yeah.
looked, and then I recognized him. Of course, I jump up and I give him a hug, and he grabs me
Oh
by
my
my
god.
shoulders, and he looks me in the eyes. He's like, "I always knew you'd do it. I knew it."
Wow.
Yeah, I get emotional thinking about it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
And I just want to make sure, say just to make sure that I got his name. It's Jeff Boone.
it's Jeff Bone.
Jeff
Bohn, but
Bone.
pronounced Bone. Yeah, and he's still around. I see him every now and again, and he's still so supportive of me and my work. He really, I had other teachers that recognized I had a talent for this, but he was the first person who really not only recognized I had a talent, but tried to encourage me to give me, books like by Elmore Leonard. And he really started me on my Elmore Leonard odyssey because I went from swag to
52
50,
pickup.
52 pickup. Thank you. 52 pickup. And then from 52 pickup, went on to
Did
some of the
Mr. Bone
Westerns.
give you 52 pickup, or did you find that
No,
one
he
on
didn't give
your
me
own?
52 pickup.
That's even worse than swag.
Yeah. 52 pickup is darker than swag. Swag, you can kind of, if you kind of squint, you're like, that's not too bad. There's some adult situation this way. No, 52 pickup is straight up hardcore, old school Detroit,
Yeah.
early Elmore Leonard, take no prisoners, all straight whiskey, no chaser. And then from that, I went on to City Primeval,
Mm.
and then of course Glitz. And again, I just became such a fan of his. I devoured everything, after that. And even as I started writing my own more serious stories, I still was reading Elmer Leonard stuff. And I love how I think the great writers are able to sort of transcend genre specifications, So he
Yeah.
goes from writing hardcore, 70s era, American Zoetrope type books, that
Hmm.
early American sort of cinema, but in a literary form, that 70s era cinema, to writing, hardcore 1920, 1930s Prohibition era, the Moonshine War and stuff like that, and then going all the way back. to the westerns. And so, but then also, you look up and he writes a book like Tishomingo Blues. The thing that I always take from Leonard, his career, is that you can write what you want. Like, you write what the hell you want. A writer is a writer,
Yeah,
a storyteller is a storyteller. The genre is only there so people know where to put the books in bookstores.
that's a great way to put it. Now, did you grow up in Virginia or somewhere
Yes,
else?
yeah. I grew up in rural Virginia, on the coast, on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. My father was a fisherman, waterman for about
Oh
30
wow,
years. A lot of people I knew worked in the seafood, aquaculture workforce, but also, a lot of agriculture around where I grew up at, because again, we're in rural Virginia. And so I grew up, kind of poor. My parents didn't have a lot of money, but we always had a lot of books. My mom was a huge reader. My grandmother read, I think, every Harlequin romance ever written. My aunt was a huge horror fan, so that's where I got my Stephen King fix. And my uncle, one of my uncles, was a huge, huge crime fiction, detective fiction fan. So he would give me his, like, that's where I got the Raymond Chandler stuff from, and the Ross McDonald stuff, but also some of the more esoteric crime writers of that time. Like he was a huge Jim Thompson fan. So I read Jim Thompson before it was fashionable. Um, and like the Grifters and Pop 1280 and The Killer Inside Me. He was big on Mickey Spillane, so I read a lot of Mike Hammer stuff growing up.
sure.
He gave me a lot of Chester Himes, Kind of Comes to Harlem, Blind Man with a Gun, stuff like that. So I was always surrounded by reading and books, and so it when you grow up really poor, sometimes reading is your only outlet, your only escape. And so for me, reading and then later writing became sort of my outlet and my escape.
I mean, I think reading is the best escape, and because you can literally go anywhere, anytime. It's one of the reasons I'm so lucky to get to do this
Mm-hmm.
podcast. But it sounds like basically at 7. I mean, if you're writing short stories at 7, that this was just in your bones. Like this is just something you always knew you wanted to do. That's
It's funny because it was, but I never thought I'd make money at it. Like I grew up in a very blue collar sort of surrounding background, and so
yeah.
I always thought, well, I'll get a real job when I get older. I'll work in a plant, or I'll drive a delivery truck, or where I come from, a really good job is getting like a government job. There's a naval shipyard near where I grew up at, and so
Okay.
everybody aspired. If you couldn't get into college and get away, you aspired to get a job at the shipyard. And I worked a lot of different jobs growing up. I hated all of them. Writing was the only thing I felt like I really was good at, and the only thing I wanted to do. And and so it was a struggle. I think sometimes people see what my career has become and think it was an overnight success. But I didn't publish my first book till I was like 36. And so
So it took you 29 years from the time you
yeah,
started. It
yeah,
took you 29 years. Uh, I mean, one of the reasons why there's a lot of reasons, like I said earlier, but like one of the reasons why it's fun to talk to someone, we talked to a handful of people, like Dennis Lehane we spoke to, and I think he's got over a dozen books under his belt at this point, and I think I've read that you hold him in really high esteem, and I think he's one of the members of the varsity team right now for sure. I think you have your fifth book is coming out in about by the time this episode comes out, your fifth book
hmm
will be out. Is that right?
yes, yes.
So, which is interesting, and I'm just curious to get your take on this because one thing that Elmore used to say was it took about 1,000,000 words to really know what you're doing, and obviously short stories would play into that. But at this point, do you feel like you've sort of turned a corner, or like at this point, like now, do you feel like you're getting really good, or do you still feel like you're figuring out your style? Because it's a big difference in terms of,
Yeah,
and I'm just curious from your standpoint, like you know your work better than anyone, but
yeah.
um,
That's a really good question. I think for me, like if I go back and look at my very first crime novel, which is My Darkest Prayer,
yeah,
um, I'm not embarrassed by that book. I mean, but I do see, things I've gotten better at. Things, I think, we all start writing. People tell you write what you know, but you also, you know, the sincerest form of flattery is impersonation. And so of course, when I look at that book, I can see a lot of me trying to sound like Dennis Lane, trying to sound like Walter Mosely, trying to write dialogue in that very, utilitarian staccato way that Elmore Leonard does. There's a lot of, you can see a lot of my influences on my sleeve in that book. And I think when I hit All the Sinners Bleed, which was my most recent book, other than the one that
Yeah.
will be out when this airs, I think when I hit All the Sinners Bleed, it sort of made me feel like, okay, my style, if we want to call it that, this is the purest distillation of it. This is taking everything that I've encountered, everything that influences me, and creating, a specific sort of stylistic approach that works for me. A lot of different things go into that. I experimented with different things in Blacktop Wasteland and Razorblade Tears and My Darkest Prayer, and also I wrote a number of short. I've written a lot of short stories, and so I've experimented with style in that. And what I think came together with All the Sinners is a very unique way for me, and I don't mean I'm unique. I mean for me, a unique way of writing. For instance, I with All Sinners, it really coalesced this idea that I can write like a third person omniscient narrator in a hyper literary style, but then have the dialogue be very colloquial. Have the internal monologue of a character be very colloquial, very down to earth. But then when you're doing you pull back, so to speak, and do the omniscient narrator, you can sort of speak with like, the voice of God. And then you can come back in and bring it back down to earth when you have two people talk to each other. And a lot of that I learned, or stole from the writers that I have on my Mount Rushmore. Dennis does that very well. I think Walter Mosely does it about as well as anybody. Of
Sure.
course, and like we were talking about Elmore Leonard, I think Elmore Leonard, pound for pound, is the greatest dialogue writer in crime fiction history. I don't think there's anybody who writes dialogue so naturally and so what appears to be effortlessly than Elmore Leonard.
Mm-hmm.
The definition of genius is taking difficult things and making them look easy, and taking easy things and making them look more complicated. And I don't think anybody did that better than him. I'm sure your listeners are fans of him and know his rules of writing. And the one rule that always stuck out to me: if it sounds like writing, take it out. I think the other one is also, don't worry about the commas and grammar. Basically, you put those in later. Those two have really stuck with me. And if you read my books, you can definitely see that influence pretty plainly as far as the way that I like to write. I like to write dialogue in a way that feels natural. In a real conversation, as we're having right now, people cut each other off, people pause. I try to reflect that stylistically in the way that I write it, both formatting and also just the language.
I mean, Elmore obviously is one of the greats when it comes to dialogue, but a lot of that, I think, just comes from being a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
And letting people talk and processing it, and then just having that ear. I mean, when we a few episodes ago, we actually covered Alex Leonard, my podcast partner. We covered swag. One of the things that we both felt that had happened in that was probably the first book, and Elmore later on would talk about this himself. It's probably the first book where he just let the characters talk. And he let the characters guide him. Once he sort of unlocked it, he could just let them go. You mentioned experimenting. Are you still writing a ton of short stories, or is it just novels only at this point because you're a best-selling novelist?
I actually still like writing short stories. I've written a couple. I have one that came out late last year. Was a different type of story. I got invited to write for Goldsboro Books in England. They were having
Okay.
I think it was their 50th or 75th anniversary, and they wanted a collection of writers that they really liked. So they asked me to write a story. So I was able to write. I wrote a little cozy locked room mystery for them. That was fun to do, a little different than my regular style. And then most recently, had a horror short story published in Cemetery Dance magazine, which is a periodical magazine of horror stories. A lot of people know it's associated with Stephen King. A couple years ago, I won the Anthony for short story. I've won that twice. Short stories is where I cut my teeth. For a long time, I didn't think I'd be a novelist. I thought I'd just be a short story writer. I didn't think I had the sort of mental stamina to write a novel. But a good friend of mine, a guy named Todd Robinson, who used to publish a magazine of hard-boiled crime short stories called Thug Lit. He from New York City. He told me, he said, man, all a book is a bunch of short stories that are connected. And sort of that opened up the doorway for me to write crime novels. When I was growing up, I never thought I'd write crime novels set where I live because I felt like nobody really cared. Because crime in small towns is very rarely who done it.
Mm,
It's always a can you prove it? We all know who did it, and so but
yeah.
reading Leonard, I grew up on mysteries, right? I grew up on whether you want to call it American noir mysteries or,
Mm-hmm.
I also read a lot of English mysteries growing up. So I read a lot of Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and P.D. James and so on and so
Sure.
forth, Colin Dexter, folks like that. It's so for a long time, I sort of understood mystery as the end all be all of crime fiction, right? I didn't really think about other subgenres. And then reading Leonard, and which led me to like George V. Higgins and the Friends of Eddie Coyle and stuff like that. I was like, oh, you can
Yeah.
write a story that is a crime story that is about a heist or is about a robbery or is about revenge. It doesn't the mystery doesn't have to be central to the narrative. And I think again going back to Leonard, I've said this before. He's on the Mount Rushmore for me because he's again probably the best. I guess up there with Donald Westlake, he's probably the best caper writer
Hmm.
or heist writer in my estimation. I mean, there's other folks obviously that will think about other people, but for me, Leonard always felt realistic, but not ponderous. It felt like
Hmm.
this could happen, but we're still in the realm of a book, so it's of course heightened reality. One of my favorite books by him is Pagan Babies. I love Pagan Babies,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and I think it's such a good book because it's about non-professional criminals. These are people who have found themselves in a situation where a lot of us could maybe find ourselves, and maybe we wouldn't react the same way. But I love Pagan Babies. I can't remember the line verbatim, but it has one of my favorite lines where the character who's an ex-cop is going to take the money. Spoiler alert, he's going to take the money at the end. He tells
Yeah.
the nun, he's basically like challenging her. He's like, if you want to stop me, sister, you can go ahead and shoot me. And because he doesn't think she will. And she does. And I just love the humor of that. I love the nature of that situation. Very realistic. But I'll go back to something you said. I do think great dialogue writers are people who are great listeners. I try to listen. I used to be a bouncer at a bar.
Okay.
And I used to love listening to people talking in bars because
I
you're
bet.
hearing a full panoply of human interactions. You're seeing people on a first date. You're seeing people you're seeing people on a last date.
On
You're
their
seeing
very
people,
last day. Yeah.
yeah, you're seeing people brokenhearted, and you're seeing people finding love. You're seeing people out with their friends celebrating, and you're seeing people out with their friends consoling. And so when you're in a bar, you see, like I said, the full range of many human emotions. And the secret to like for me, learning to write dialogue was to learning to listen to those conversations, learning to
Oh my
listen
gosh.
when friends are boosting each other up, or learning to listen when friends are running down the friend's ex, or learning to listen when people are just kind of mulling over their issues, their life, looking at a drink, and
Right.
watching the way the light, catches the whiskey in the glass. And so, and then I worked retail for a long time too. I was a
Yeah.
retail manager for a long time, and so I would walk through the store, be in the aisles, just listening to conversations, listen to the way people talk, and I try my best to translate that. Dialogue is both a way to convey expository information, but it's also the way to convey character. You know, the way characters talk, what they say, is also almost as important as how they say it.
Sure.
You take a book like one of my favorites. I actually have a signed autographed copy of it, Tishomingo Blues. You take a book like that.
Oh.
Everything you learn, you need to know about the lead character. You learn when we see him on the top of that, small little diving board. You know everything about him based on the way he's talking to himself. Because dialogue is also us talking to ourselves. It's the character talking to themselves, and you learn a lot about that dude before he jumps off that little platform.
Yeah.
You take a book like The Hot Kid.
Mm-hmm.
You learn a lot based on the way that character talks to his bosses versus the way he talks to the people he encounters in the street. I mean, I
I
think the
wish I
most
could talk like him. He's so good.
well, you look at somebody like Raylan Givens. A lot of people know Raylan's from Justified, but when you read Pronto, you
Mm-hmm.
read Riding the Rap. It's like Ray- Raylan. If for a guy that wasn't from the South, Elmore Leonard probably gets the cadence and the verbiage and the verbosity of Southern folks probably as well as anybody who's not a native born
Yeah, well,
Southerner.
I think he was born in New Orleans. He
Hmm.
moved around a lot, and growing up, I think his dad worked for Chevrolet, or yeah, I think his dad worked for Chevrolet or General Motors. Is there better people watching or people listening at a bar or at a funeral home?
I think both. You see people
Yeah.
in their most extreme aspects. I worked at a funeral home for a little while, and I learned a lot about learning about empathy for people, learning about understanding. I think that helped me with my writing as far as with the characters. Learning the empathy for villains.
Hmm.
The book that I have coming out, King of Ashes. There's some very nasty characters in there. There's this trope in writing that the villain thinks he's a hero in his own story. I kind of push back on that a little bit. I think a lot of times villains know they're jerks.
Yeah.
They just don't care. They have a goal. So it's not that they're being heroic. They have a goal they want to accomplish. That being said, you know, giving a little bit of humanity to a villain, creating a villain, and I think I've gotten better with my villains. And again, we'll talk about the master here. I think Leonard. I always felt like in most of his books, there weren't hero and villains. There were people on the opposite side of an issue. You know,
Right.
like in Pronto. Well, is it Pronto or Riding a Rap? I'm sorry. The character the Zip, right? He's a
Hmm.
villain. He's a mafia hitman, but he's kind of just doing his job. In his mind, he's not this sort of, megalomaniac sociopath. He's just a guy doing his job. His job just happens to be killing people. Because you tell the story from the opposite end. Raylan could seem like the sociopath. Who
Well, I
tells the guy that you
mean,
have till sundown to get out? You know.
yeah. I'm curious. So you grew up on the coast of Virginia. I lived for a summer in South Boston, Virginia, which
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know what that is.
is further west and close to the North Carolina border. And I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Minnesota, but South Boston, Virginia, and then I lived in Tupelo, Mississippi. I worked in
Oh,
Boonville,
wow.
Mississippi, and it was probably about 8 9 months, and that was definitely like the first time I was selling books door to door. Um, it was the first extended period of time I'd spent in the South. Um,
Mhm.
what is it about Virginia that is unique in terms of compared to other parts of the South in your mind?
That's a great question. For me, the thing that I think is unique to Virginia, Virginia is sort of the midpoint. You're too far south to be northern, but there's a lot of Southerners that will say Virginia's too far north to be truly Southern. But I think that creates a unique sort of experience for people in Virginia. We're in the Virginia is a multitude of different regions all in one state. We're Appalachia. When you go to the western part of the state, you go out to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The
Hmm.
Appalachian Mountains that run down through Asheville, North Carolina, that run through that western part of out of Roanoke down through Shenandoah Valley. But also, like you said, you're the lowlands, the marshes on the other side of the state in the Chesapeake Bay, and then you have like the military presence down in
Hmm.
North Carolina, in Norfolk, near North Carolina. The central part of the state, you have a lot of farming, like you said, tobacco farms, soybean farms. There's a lot of agriculture. But then if you go to Northern Virginia, Arlington and Alexandria and the suburbs of D.C., it's almost like a whole nother state. It's a whole nother world. You're
Hmm.
just outside the corridors of power. So for me, Virginia gives the storyteller uh, a plethora of stories they can tell, of lives that they can examine. It's so funny because if I go to New York City, people tell me I have an accent. If I go down, but if I go to Mississippi or I go to Oxford, Mississippi, or I go to Birmingham, Alabama, I don't have enough of an accent. So Virginia kind of sits in the middle there. But I'll tell you, um, I know some good old boys from Virginia that I'll put up against any good old boy in any other part of the South any day of the week and twice on Sundays. I had a cousin, I had a cousin whose nickname was the Maul, Maul, because he punched the guy one time so hard the doctors thought he'd been attacked with a hammer. So,
Oh my gosh.
I'll put my country boys up against any other country boys in any other rural part of the state or the country. But for me, Virginia does occupy a unique space in both literature and fiction. One of the things I love about being able to write about Virginia is because I got tired of every time you see Virginia in a movie, it's always about Langley. It's always about the
Mm.
CIA or Quantico. And there's a whole other side of the state that exists. People that have histories and lives and stories to tell. So, I like talking about Chesapeake Bay, and if we happen to have a character chop up another character and put them in a crab pot, so
Hmm.
be it.
Is there a point when you're writing, when do you decide if a story is going to be set in Virginia? Is it's always in Virginia, or you start and then you discover, you learn more about the characters and then it makes sense for them to be there? Or like at what point in your writing process do you decide on the setting?
That's an interesting question. I just kind of sort of fell into writing about Virginia and like writing about different parts of the state because I wasn't, in one way I didn't have any competition about it. I could sort of define the state the way I wanted because a lot of stories aren't set in the rural part of the country or the rural
Yeah.
part of the state, and so I could sort of shape that narratively the way I wanted to. I have given thought to that here lately though because I have an idea for a book that would start in Virginia but would mainly take place in Los Angeles, and to be country
Mm.
boy gets in some trouble, tries to get away, goes out to the hills of L.A. and finds more trouble out there. Water finds its level, so to speak. I think at first it was just sort of a natural progression of like, oh, I'm in Virginia, I write about Virginia, and then it kind of got easy because like I know the state so well, I know the area so well. It kind of cut down on my copy editors having to correct things because I know the area I'm dealing with, and so but recently I've given a lot of thought to writing outside of of course as a writer you excuse me, you want to challenge yourself. You don't want to sit on your laurels. um, Walter Mosely said this to me one time. He said, being comfortable to a writer is like too much sugar to tea.
Mm.
It'll ruin it. And so you've got to sort of not rest on that comfortability. So for me, having to write something set in L.A. or really set in Pasadena would be a challenge, but it's a challenge that I look forward to. And I think all my writing I think will always have a touch of Virginia in it. Virginia is my heart and my home. It's a part of me.
Yeah.
And so, but I do think I want to like sort of push my writing outside of just the confines of the Old Dominion and see what it looks like when you take, for lack of a better phrase, Virginia sensibilities to the West Coast. What does that look like? And how does that, I'm a big fan of old movies, and so I love movies like Coogan's Bluff or there's a really bad movie called Next of Kin with Patrick Swayze, but I love the
It
idea
wasn't a
of
bad movie. He had a
yeah.
crossbow. Come on.
But I love the idea of the sort of the juxtaposition of the rural character, the country character, the quote unquote country bumpkin outwitting, the more metropolitan or urban villains, so to speak. One of my favorite Leonard books is The Moonshine War.
Yeah.
That's all about big city gangsters, underestimating sun.
Yeah. I think, just to go back to something you were saying, there's a movie from, it was in the 80s, and it is exactly, it's what you're talking about, but that you have both twists, you have both sides. It's called Shoot to Kill, and it's
Mm-hmm.
Tom Berenger and Sidney Poitier,
Sidney Poitier. Yep.
and like there's certain movies that you can never remake, like you can never ever remake. But if they remade that one, I would be, because it's just such a fun story. I'd be totally happy to see it, a new version of that, because I love that dynamic, where you get to see both these very different characters shine in a different environment. That's a lot of fun. So, are you writing this story of a Virginian who ends up in Pasadena now, or not quite? It's just sort of early stages.
Not quite. It's on the research level. I actually, to be perfectly honest, me and my agent are kind of going back and forth. I have another idea that is a more traditional sort of set in Virginia story. I think both of them are good ideas. But if I have to be perfectly honest, that I tentatively titled it the California book. The California book, it's got my attention. I think it's going to be the one that I end up working on just because there are interesting things I want to say about that. I bet I've had the opportunity to travel a little bit. I had never been to LA before my books got published, so
Oh
I've
well.
been to LA like 4 times now. I grew up reading, the quintessential LA crime novels. From Chandler all the way down to Elroy Leonard. To I'm sorry, to Elmore, Leonard, but also James Elroy, Robert Craze. Yeah, of course, I mentioned Walter Mosely a couple times, but so LA has always fascinated me as a reader and as a
Yeah.
writer, and so yeah, I think that's going to end up being the book, just because that's the one that keep for anybody who's out there listening who's an aspiring writer, you know, the story that you can't stop thinking about is probably a story you should write.
LA, it does get a bad rap in terms of its cultural place in the U.S., but I think that there's so much culture in LA. Obviously, Pasadena is not technically LA, but Pasadena is a very, very interesting city as well. There's a place in LA called the Grand Central Market in downtown. Have you ever been there?
No, I haven't. No.
It just You should check it out. It's great. It's Did you see Midnight Run?
Yes, yes, Al Pacino, Charles Grodin,
So
not Al. I'm sorry, Robert De Niro
De
and
Niro,
Charles
yeah.
Grodin.
And the scene where De Niro and Joe Pantoliano meet at the Chinese restaurant,
Hmm.
and it's sort of like at a bar, like at a counter of a Chinese restaurant. That's the Grand Central Market, and so there's a bunch of
Oh,
restaurants and like food stalls and market. It's an amazing place.
yeah, I'm definitely have to check it out.
No, I think there is something, because Elmore is obviously known for, he was referred to as the Dickens of Detroit, but he wrote a lot outside of Detroit. He wrote a lot in Florida. He wrote a lot of his westerns. He wrote Moonshine Wars, which was in Appalachia. He wrote The Hot Kid, which is in Oklahoma. So I want to ask you about King of Ashes, and if you tell us anything that you'd like to tell us. Obviously, everyone should go buy it and read it and love it themselves. But I do want to talk to you about that. But before, I'm just curious. I got to read a sort of an advanced copy of the biography that's coming out about Elmore, and one of the things that comes through is just his diligence and how hard he worked. Every day, and there were periods where he was writing 7 days a week. What's your routine like? Are you writing all the time? Do you write for set hours each day? Like, I'm always curious about that because everyone seems to do it differently.
It's funny because I got my publishing deal in 2019, right? And my book came out. My major, I can say major, but my book with a major of Big Five came out in 2020. I was always writing before that. I just, I was on contract. I just liked ideas and I just go to route. So my writing style changed a little bit once I became like on contract and things like that. Um, because when I'm on contract, it's just so intense. It's
Hmm.
so labor intensive. Usually takes me about 9 months to a year to write a first draft, and of course, then it's the editing process, stuff like that. For me, when I'm writing, I write every day. Like when I'm working on an actual book, I write every day.
Yeah.
Sometimes I take off Sunday, but mostly I write every day. I try not to write too much during the day though. Like I'll write 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and then that's it. For me, I don't want to push myself because I feel like once you sort of push yourself too hard, you're not getting the good quality story that you want.
Mm.
Um, but then once I turn it in, my editor gets it back in about 2 3 weeks, and then once I get it back from her, I'll go over her notes, and then I will send it out to some friends, some very trusted friends, some writers, some non-writers, um, and then once I do that, I'll go over their notes, and that's pretty much it. I'm not a big rewriter. I know some people that love to write, 4 and 5 drafts. I'm not about that life. You getting 2 drafts out of me at the most, and really that second draft is just a correction of the copy edit, or the editor notes. Um, I usually don't do an outline, but I do what's called a pretty heavy synopsis, usually 2 or 3 pages, sort of a stream of consciousness, sort of idea about the book. What is it? Who is it? Like for instance, for All the Sinners Bleed, it's a mystery novel set in the Southern Gothic novel,
Hmm.
first black sheriff in a small southern town, so on and so forth. I kind of just tell myself the story. I use that as a guide. I don't. The story doesn't have to follow that exactly, but it's definitely sort of a guide. Once I'm done with a book and the book is pretty much finished, I do like to take a break. I like, there was a point where I was writing 3 different separate projects at the same time,
Oh wow.
because when I first started writing, my agent, who's a really great agent, he's getting me multiple financial streams. We didn't know what the book was going to do. So at one point, I was writing an audio drama for Audible, called Broke Down Profits. I was writing my second novel for my publisher called Razorblade Tears. I was working with Questlove on a kid's book.
With
I was doing
Questlove?
all that at the same time. Yeah, I did a kids book with
Oh
Questlove
my
for the
gosh.
Roots book called The Rhythm of Time. We're actually re-releasing it on paperback this year, and there's a couple more. It's a trilogy, so there's two more books to
Oh,
come in that series. But I was doing all that at the same time.
I've
I'll
got a
never do that
two-year-old.
again. That was a
I'll pick it up.
Yeah, that was a terrible idea. I'll never do that again. All those different projects at
Oh,
the
sure.
same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so now that I've sort of finished those other projects, I can focus on my own stuff. Yeah, once I finish, like for instance, once I finished King of Ashes here recently, I haven't really been doing a lot of writing. I kind of just been letting it marinate, sort of letting my mind sort of readjust and get to a place where I can leave King of Ashes behind when I'm ready to move on to the next thing.
Questlove is somebody who seems to be incredibly talented at whatever he does, but were there times you are an accomplished, best-selling, award-winning novelist? Were there times where you just like he's probably not as good as a writer as he is a musician or a filmmaker. And so I'm just, I that experience sounds. Maybe you just share a little bit about that experience. That
Oh
sounds
yeah, it was
really
really
fun,
interesting
really
because
interesting.
it really was. He's so smart and brilliant.
Have you seen his
He's
Sly Stone
he's a
documentary?
polymath. Yeah, oh, yeah. He's a polymath. He's a Renaissance guy.
Yeah,
He knows a lot about a lot of different subjects. The thing about writing with him that I thought was interesting was you can see musically he's a big idea person, big picture person, right? So he comes up with a large idea, he comes up with a plot, he comes up with where a sort of narrative. And then where I came in working with him was like to take that and sort of distill it down into a story, into a narrative, and then take the big plot ideas, the big picture things that he wanted, write them, let him read them and see, add his notes to it. So it really was a true collaboration of us working together to create this, what I thought was a really fun, interesting little sci-fi story for kids. It was fun for me. Uh, One other thing that I took from this experience was really great. It proved to me that I'm a true storyteller, and
hmm.
what I mean by that is, I you get lucky enough to have a couple successful books or books that people want to read, and you sort of start thinking, okay, well, am I leaning on tropes? Am I a good storyteller when I can't shoot somebody in the face,
Hmm.
um, when I can't use Chekhov's gun, so to speak. And so writing these kids books with him really made me realize, yeah, I am a good storyteller. I can take a kid's story and still give it gravitas, but also still be funny. A lot of people, my books have some humor. They're not a laugh riot, but they have some humor.
Oh,
But
for sure.
using that humor, using that, I could still use that in a kid's book. And so it really was a sort of a motivational thing. It made me feel better about myself that I could do it. It was like,
Interesting.
wow, I can do this. I can write. I think any writer of crime fiction and will tell you that sometimes you just have something happen in a crime fiction book because like I got to figure out how to plot the next point in the plot. So let's hit somebody in the face with a brick, or let's have somebody fall out a window, or you can't do that in a kid's book. So it really convinced me, like, yeah, I do have a talent for storytelling regardless of the genre. But yeah, working with him was fun. He doesn't sleep. So like I did get a text at like 3 a.m. He was like, Sean, his real name is Amir. It's like, this is Amir. I got an idea for the book. And I'm like, this could have been an 8 o'clock conversation, but it's like, but
Yeah.
he was really fun to work with. And I really, it's one of those experiences I'll always treasure.
How did it come about? I mean, did you have an idea and you reached out to
he
him? Did he reach
he
out? Like,
wanted he had written a couple of nonfiction. Yeah, he had written a couple of nonfiction books, and he wanted to write a fiction book. And he kind of looked around at. He wanted to work with someone who's an African American. So he looked at African American writers, and somehow an early copy of Blacktop Wasteland, which is my first novel with Flatiron, got into his hands. I think he got an arc of it or something,
uh huh.
and he read it. He said, "Wow, this guy can really write." So when they reached out to me, I was kind of like, "Are y'all sure? Like, has he read my books?"
Yeah.
Because people tend to get cracked in the jaw with wrenches a lot in my stuff. And they're like, yeah, but he liked your style of writing. Okay, so we talked. I actually got to go to New York. This was all before pandemic.
Yeah.
I got to go to New York and meet him in his dressing room at the Tonight Show, and we really hit it off. We had a really good conversation. And then the pandemic almost immediately happened right after that, and I thought that project was dead in the water. But what ended up happening was we talked a lot over Zoom. We communicated, and it made it almost better because everybody was at home, so we just was talking over Zoom and sort of going back and forth about the idea and the story, and it came out from there. So it was really fun. It was a really interesting experience, and it gave me a big dose of confidence in myself.
That's really interesting. That's great. I had no idea that you had written those. I do want to hear about King of Ashes a little bit, but I also I've been meaning to ask you. This is the Elmore Leonard podcast, but he had a lot of great influences, and you mentioned Friends of Eddie Coyle, written by George V. Higgins, which had a huge impact on Elmore. But you mentioned Walter Mosely a couple times, and I think Walter Mosely, I think he's one of the great living writers of anything, and he writes everything. I'd just be curious to hear about, is there something specific that you learned from Walter Mosely or you look up to Walter Mosely for? Is there...
Walter gave me this sort of mental permission to write about the black people that I knew. When you read Devil in a Blue Dress,
Yeah.
even though it's set in the 50s, I recognize those people. Even though they're all living in Watts, they're all from Louisiana, they're all from Texas, they're all from the South. And so reading about these people, they reminded me of my grandfather and my uncles and my aunts and my parents. And so reading Walter Mosely, say, even though they're set generations apart, it made me realize I can write about the people I knew. And it can be not just commercially viable, which everybody wants that, but artistically viable. So Walter's huge. He cast a long shadow of every American writer since he debuted. But like I've said before, he's on my Mount Rushmore with Lahane and Elmore Leonard, and I think the fourth person, because there are four people on Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
I think the fourth person, it's it's a tie between
Okay.
it's a tie between Chester Himes and Sue Grafton. I think
Wow.
for me, Chester Himes writing about the African American experience in the height of not just Jim Crow but segregation,
Hmm.
from a position of someone who had suffered so much, was incredibly influential on me as a reader. Um, Sue Grafton is somebody who, for me, sort of, she kicked down the doors of misogyny in crime fiction. She took a female character, and she's not a femme fatale, and she's not a sidekick, and she's not a girl Friday. She's the main character, and she's someone to be, the Kinsey Mahone. A is for alibi, B is for
Yes, the
burglary.
alphabet. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was a tough character without ever sacrificing her femininity. And I thought that's a big deal. I thought that was very important. I would also like to say, while we got a minute, though, stylistically, a lot of writers who had influence on me are some of my contemporaries. There's a writer from LA by the way of the Ozarks, a guy named Jordan Harper,
Hmm.
who is an incredible writer, wrote a really good book set in Northern California called She Rides Shotgun. And then he switched gears and wrote this incredible sort of modern day LA corruption novel called Everybody Knows, which I like to describe it as, Chinatown meets The Player.
Oh, wow.
The movie Chinatown meets the Robert Altman movie The Player. And that book has just blown me away. And then he went back to Northern California to write a book called The Last King of California, which takes place in the more sort of rural, down your luck, dirty white boys of Northern California. And I had the privilege of reading a book that he's working on now. I think he's just one of the finest crime writers working today. His style is so unique to him. I want to mention another writer, if I can,
Of
real
course.
quick. Kelly Garrett, who writes domestic suspense thrillers. I think Kelly is really underrated. She's getting some more notoriety now. By the time this podcast comes out, the Anthony Awards probably will be announced, and she's been nominated for one. She's won it twice. She's an incredible writer. I think she brings such a great sense of humor, but also a sense of gravitas and understanding to her stuff. Another writer that's really been a big influence on me, a contemporary, Jennifer Hillier from Canada. She's a thriller writer. She writes really dark thrillers like Jar of Hearts or uh, uh, Little Secrets. She's an incredibly interesting stylist when it comes to writing. And then one more writer that I think is someone who I think is underrated. He's not truly a crime writer, but he's from my neck of the woods, and I think he's just a fabulous author. This guy named David Joy. He's written a few books, Where All the Light Tends to Go. Those who knew us well just an incredible modern day Appalachian sort of prophet in his writing and the things that he chooses to write about. Like I said, not truly a crime writer. There's crime in his books, but it's not central to the story.
Yeah.
He's more of a Dickinson type writer, where he takes the Appalachian area and talks about it from the culture, from the sociological aspect of it, right down to the geology and the ecology of it. So those are writers that have really influenced me, both in the past and currently.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I'm familiar with some, but definitely not all. And I'm sure a lot of people listening have just found a handful of new aisles to go down at the bookstore. So thank you for that. We are running low on time. What, if anything, can you tell us about King of Ashes?
Yeah, so I'd love to talk about it really quick. King of Ashes is my fifth novel. It's basically the story of the Carruthers family. Older brother Roman, middle sister Nevaeh, baby brother Dante. As the book opens, Roman is living in Atlanta, Georgia as a financial advisor. He's left his family business behind in the small town of Jefferson Run, Virginia, where his family owns a crematory. And it's just a crematory. It's just a place to cremate bodies. He gets a phone call one morning that his dad's been in a car accident. He's in a coma. He has to come home. When he gets home, he finds out that the car accident may not have been an accident because his baby brother Dante owes over $200,000 to some of the worst gangsters you want to owe money to. And so Roman tries to use his financial advising wizardry to help get the family out from under this debt. And what he learns is he's actually pretty good at being a criminal. And so there's sort of a crisis of conscience for him. This family also has dealt with a very serious traumatic experience. When they were teenagers, their mother disappeared. She's been missing for 20 years. And everybody in this small town thinks their father killed her because she was having an affair. And he owns a crematory. And sort of 1 + 1 = 2 in their mind. And so they've all dealt with this trauma in different ways. Dante, the baby brother, self-medicates a lot. Nevaeh has a very complicated personal life while she tries to hold the business together. And of course, Roman has sort of given himself over to the largesse of living in Atlanta among the rich and famous there. But this book brings them all back together, and it's a thriller. It's a tragedy. It's a story that I think hopefully asks the question: how far would you go to protect the people you love, and how far is too far?
That sounds fantastic.
No, thank you.
Sean, this has been such a thrill and such a great conversation. And thank you again for taking the time, joining us on the Elmore Leonard podcast. Really looking forward to reading King of Ashes.
Well, thank you guys for having me. It's been so much fun. Anybody who knows me knows I talk about Elmore Leonard a lot. I think he's not only a great crime writer, one of the best of all time, but he's one of our great writers in general in American history. You can read Elmore Leonard's books, and see the history of America from the 70s up until the 2000s, and then even in the 20s and 30s. He's a great chronicler of this thing we call the American experience, and so I'm a huge fan.
The Elmore Leonard podcast is produced and edited by Judd Rubin. Music by Greg Ahee. Hosted by Judd Rubin and Alex Leonard. Executive produced by Peter Leonard. Copyright 2025, Elmore Leonard Inc. Please visit us at elmoreleonardofficial.com or send us an email at hello@theelmoreleonardpodcast.com.